CHAPTER 11. Fancy and reality. Have you ever seen the moon? Asked a professor ironically of one of his pupils. No, sir, replied the pupil, still more ironically, but I must say, I have heard it spoken of. In one sense, the pupil's witty answer might be given by a large majority of sublunary beings. How many people have heard speak of the moon, who have never seen it at least through a glass or a telescope? How many have never examined the map of their satellite? In looking at a selenographic map, one peculiarity strikes us, contrary to the arrangement followed for that of the Earth and Mars. The continents occupy more particularly the southern hemisphere of the lunar globe. These continents do not show such decided, clear, and regular boundary lines as South America, Africa, and the Indian Peninsula. Their angular, capricious, and deeply indented coasts are rich in gulfs and peninsulas. They remind one of the confusion in the islands of the Sound, where the land is excessively indented, if navigation ever existed on the surface of the moon. It must have been wonderfully difficult and dangerous, and we may well pity the Selenite sailors and hydrographers. The former, when they came upon these perilous coasts, the latter when they took the soundings of its stormy banks. We may also notice that, on the lunar sphere, the South Pole is much more continental than the North Pole. On the latter, there is but one slight strip of land, separated from other continents by vast seas. Toward the south, continents clothe almost the whole of the hemisphere. It is even possible that the Selenites have already planted the flag on one of their poles, while Franklin, Ross, Cain Dumont d'Urville and Lambert have never yet been able to attain that unknown point of the terrestrial globe. As to islands, they are numerous on the surface of the moon, nearly all oblong or circular, and as if traced with the compass, they seem to form one vast archipelago, equal to that charming group lying between Greece and Asia Minor, and which mythology in ancient times adorned with most graceful legends. Involuntarily the names of Naxos, Tenedos, and Carpathos rise before the mind, and we seek vainly for Ulysses' vessel, or the clipper of the Argonauts. So at least it was in Michel Ardan's eyes. To him it was a Grecian archipelago that he saw on the map. To the eyes of his matter-of-fact companions, the aspect of these coasts recalled rather the parcelled-out land of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and where the Frenchmen discovered traces of the heroes of fable. These Americans were marking the most favorable points for the establishment of stores in the interests of lunar commerce and industry. After wandering over these vast continents, the eye is attracted by the still greater seas. Not only their formation, but their situation and aspect remind one of the terrestrial oceans. But again, as on Earth, these seas occupy the greater portion of the globe, but in point of fact, these are not liquid spaces, but plains, the nature of which the travelers hoped soon to determine. Astronomers, we must allow, have graced these pretended seas with at least odd names, which science has respected up to the present time. Michel Ardan was right when he compared this map to a tender card, got up by a Scuderi or a Chirano di Bergerac only, said he, it is no longer the sentimental card of the 17th century. It is the card of life, very neatly divided into two parts, one feminine, the other masculine. The right hemisphere for woman, the left for man. In speaking thus, Michel made his prosaic companions shrug their shoulders. Barbicane and Nicholl looked upon the lunar map from a very different point of view to that of their fantastic friend. Nevertheless, their fantastic friend was a little in the right. Judge for yourselves. In the left hemisphere stretches the sea of clouds, where human reason is so often shipwrecked. Not far off lies the sea of rains, fed by all the fever of existence. Near this is the sea of storms, where man is ever fighting against his passions, which too often gain the victory, then, worn out by deceit, treasons, infidelity, and the whole body of terrestrial misery, what does he find at the end of his career? That vast sea of humors, barely softened by some drops of the waters from the Gulf of Dew. Clouds, rain, storms, and humors. Does the life of man contain aught but these? And is it not summed up in these 4 words? The right hemisphere, dedicated to the ladies, encloses smaller seas, whose significant names contain every incident of a feminine existence. There is the Sea of Serenity, over which the young girl bends. The Lake of Dreams, reflecting a joyous future. The Sea of Nectar, with its waves of tenderness and breezes of love. The Sea of Fruitfulness, the Sea of Crises. Then the Sea of Vapors, whose dimensions are perhaps a little too confined. And lastly, that vast sea of tranquility in which every false passion, every useless dream, every unsatisfied desire is at length absorbed, and whose waves emerge peacefully into the lake of death. What a strange succession of names, what a singular division of the moon's 2 hemispheres, joined to one another like man and woman, and forming that sphere of life carried into space. And was not the fantastic Michel right in thus interpreting the fancies of the ancient astronomers? But while his imagination thus roved over the seas, his grave companions were considering things more geographically. They were learning this new world by heart. They were measuring angles and diameters. Chapter 12. Orographic details. The course taken by the projectile, as we have before remarked, was bearing it toward the moon's northern hemisphere. The travelers were far from the central point, which they would have struck, had their course not been subject to an irremediable deviation. It was past midnight, and Barbicane then estimated the distance at 750 miles, which was a little greater than the length of the lunar radius, and which would diminish as it advanced nearer to the North Pole. The projectile was then not at the altitude of the equator, but across the 10th parallel, and from that latitude, carefully taken on the map to the pole, Barbicane and his 2 companions were able to observe the moon under the most favorable conditions. Indeed, by means of glasses, the above-named distance was reduced to little more than 14 miles. The telescope of the Rocky Mountains brought the moon much nearer, but the terrestrial atmosphere singularly lessened its power. Thus, Barbicane, posted in his projectile, with the glasses to his eyes, could seize upon details which were almost imperceptible to earthly observers. "My friends," said the President in a serious voice, "I do not know whither we are going. I do not know if we shall ever see the terrestrial globe again. Nevertheless, let us proceed, as if our work would one day be useful to our fellow men. Let us keep our minds free from every other consideration. We are astronomers, and this projectile is a room in the Cambridge University, carried into space. Let us make our observations." This said, work was begun with great exactness, and they faithfully reproduced the different aspects of the moon at the different distances which the projectile reached. At the time that the projectile was as high as the 10th parallel, north latitude, it seemed rigidly to follow the 20th degree east longitude. We must here make one important remark with regard to the map by which they were taking observations. In the selenographical maps where, on account of the reversing of the objects by the glasses, the south is above and the north below, it would seem natural that, on account of that inversion, the east should be to the left hand, and the west to the right, but it is not so if the map were turned upside down, showing the moon as we see her. The east would be to the left, and the west to the right, contrary to that which exists on terrestrial maps. The following is the reason of this anomaly. Observers in the northern hemisphere, say in Europe, see the moon in the south. According to them, when they take observations, they turn their backs to the north, the reverse position to that which they occupy when they study a terrestrial map. As they turn their backs to the north, the east is on their left, and the west to their right. To observers in the southern hemisphere, Patagonia for example, the moon's west would be quite to their left, and the east to their right, as the south is behind them. Such is the reason of the apparent reversing of these two cardinal points. And we must bear it in mind, in order to be able to follow President Barbicane's observations. With the help of Barr and Moedler's Mappa Selenographica, the travelers were able at once to recognize that portion of the disk enclosed within the field of their glasses. "What are we looking at this moment?" asked Michel. "At the northern part of the Sea of Clouds," answered Barbicane. "We are too far off to recognize its nature. Are these plains composed of arid sand, as the first astronomer maintained? Or are they nothing but immense forests, according to M. Warren de la Rue's opinion, who gives the moon an atmosphere, though a very low, and a very dense one? That we shall know by, and by we must affirm nothing, until we are in a position to do so. This sea of clouds is rather doubtfully marked out upon the maps. It is supposed that these vast plains are strewn with blocks of lava from the neighboring volcanoes on its right, Ptolemy, Kerbach, Arzachel, but the projectile was advancing, and sensibly nearing it. Soon there appeared the heights, which bound the sea at this northern limit. Before them rose a mountain radiant with beauty, the top of which seemed lost in an eruption of solar rays. "That is?" asked Michel. "Copernicus," replied Barbicane. "Let us see Copernicus." This mount, situated in 9 north latitude and 20 east longitude, rose to a height of 10,600 feet above the surface of the moon. It is quite visible from the earth, and astronomers can study it with ease, particularly during the phase between the last quarter and the new moon, because then the shadows are thrown lengthways from east to west, allowing them to measure the heights. This Copernicus forms the most important of the radiating system, situated in the southern hemisphere. According to Tycho Brahe, it rises isolated like a gigantic lighthouse on that portion of the Sea of Clouds, which is bounded by the Sea of Tempests, thus lighting by its splendid rays to oceans at a time. It was a sight without an equal, those long luminous trains, so dazzling in the full moon, and which, passing the boundary chain on the north, extends to the Sea of Rains. At 1 o'clock of the terrestrial morning, the projectile, like a balloon borne into space, overlooked the top of this superb mount. Barbicane could recognize perfectly its chief features. Copernicus is comprised in the series of ringed mountains of the first order, in the division of great circles. Like Kepler and Aristarchus, which overlooked the ocean of tempests, sometimes it appeared like a brilliant point through the cloudy light, and was taken for a volcano in activity, but it is only an extinct one, alike all on that side of the moon. Its circumference showed a diameter of about 22 leagues. The glasses discovered traces of stratification produced by successive eruptions, and the neighborhood was strewn with volcanic remains, which still choked some of the craters. "There exists," said Barbicane, several kinds of sickles on the surface of the moon, and it is easy to see that Copernicus belongs to the radiating class. If we were nearer, we should see the cones bristling on the inside, which in former times were so many fiery mouths. A curious arrangement, and one without an exception on the lunar disk, is that the interior surface of these sickles is the reverse of the exterior, and contrary to the form taken by terrestrial craters, it follows, then, that the general curve of the bottom of these sickles gives a sphere of a smaller diameter than that of the moon. And why this peculiar disposition? Asked Nicholl. We do not know, replied Barbicane. What splendid radiation, said Michel. One could hardly see a finer spectacle, I think. What would you say, then, replied Barbicane, if chance should bear us toward the southern hemisphere? Well, I should say that it was still more beautiful, retorted Michel Ardan. At this moment the projectile hung perpendicularly over the sickle. The circumference of Copernicus formed almost a perfect sickle, and its steep escarpments were clearly defined. They could even distinguish a second ringed enclosure. Around spread a grayish plain, of a wild aspect, on which every relief was marked in yellow, at the bottom of the sickle, as if enclosed in a jewel case. Sparkled for one instant 2 or 3 eruptive cones, like enormous dazzling gems. Toward the north the escarpments were lowered by a depression, which would probably have given access to the interior of the crater. In passing over the surrounding plains, Barbicane noticed a great number of less important mountains, and among others, a little ringed one called Guy, La Sac, the breadth of which measured 12 miles. Toward the south, the plain was very flat, without one elevation, without one projection. Toward the north, on the contrary, till where it was bounded by the Sea of Storms, it resembled a liquid surface agitated by a storm, of which the hills and hollows formed a succession of waves suddenly congealed. Over the whole of this, and in all directions, lay the luminous lines, all converging to the summit of Copernicus. The travelers discussed the origin of these strange rays, but they could not determine their nature any more than terrestrial observers. But why, said Nicholl, should not these rays be simply spurs of mountains, which reflect more vividly the light of the sun? No, replied Barbicane, if it was so, under certain conditions of the moon, these ridges would cast shadows, and they do not cast any. And indeed, these rays only appeared when the orb of day was in opposition to the moon, and disappeared as soon as its rays became oblique. But how have they endeavored to explain these lines of light? Asked Michel, for I cannot believe that savants would ever be stranded for want of an explanation. Yes, replied Barbicane, Herschel has put forward an opinion, but he did not venture to affirm it. Never mind what was the opinion. He thought that these rays might be streams of cooled lava, which shone when the sun beat straight upon them. It may be so, but nothing can be less certain. Besides, if we pass nearer to Tycho, we shall be in a better position to find out the cause of this radiation. Do you know, my friends, what that plain, seen from the height we are at, resembles? Said Michel. No, replied Nicholl. Very well, with all those pieces of lava lengthened like rockets, it resembles an immense game of spelicans thrown pell-mell. There wants but the hook to pull them out one by one. Do be serious, said Barbicane. Well, let us be serious, replied Michel quietly. And instead of spelicans, let us put bones. This plain would then be nothing but an immense cemetery, on which would repose the mortal remains of thousands of extinct generations, do you prefer that high-flown comparison? One is as good as the other, retorted Barbicane. My word, you are difficult to please, answered Michel. My worthy friend, continued the matter-of-fact Barbicane, it matters but little what it resembles, when we do not know what it is. Well answered, exclaimed Michel, that will teach me to reason with savants. But the projectile continued to advance with almost uniform speed around the lunar disk. The travelers, we may easily imagine, did not dream of taking a moment's rest. Every minute changed the landscape, which fled from beneath their gaze. About 1:30 in the morning, they caught a glimpse of the tops of another mountain. Barbicane, consulting his map, recognized Eratosthenes. It was a ringed mountain 9,000 feet high, and one of those circles so numerous on this satellite. With regard to this, Barbicane related Kepler's singular opinion on the formation of circles. According to that celebrated mathematician, these crater-like cavities had been dug by the hand of man. For what purpose? Asked Nicholl. For a very natural one, replied Barbicane. The Selenites might have undertaken these immense works, and dug these enormous holes for a refuge and shield from the solar rays, which beat upon them during 15 consecutive days. The Selenites are not fools, said Michel. A singular idea, replied Nicholl, but it is probable that Kepler did not know the true dimensions of these circles, for the digging of them would have been the work of giants, quite impossible for the Selenites. Why, if weight on the moon's surface is 6 times less than on the earth? Said Michel. But if the Selenites are 6 times smaller? Retorted Nicholl. And if there are no Selenites, added Barbicane. This put an end to the discussion. Soon Eratosthenes disappeared under the horizon, without the projectile being sufficiently near to allow close observation. This mountain separated the Apennines from the Carpathians. In the lunar orography, they have descended some chains of mountains, which are chiefly distributed over the northern hemisphere. Some, however, occupy certain portions of the southern hemisphere also. About 2:00 in the morning, Barbicane found that they were above the 20th lunar parallel. The distance of the projectile from the moon was not more than 600 miles. Barbicane, now perceiving that the projectile was steadily approaching the lunar disk, did not despair, if not of reaching her, at least of discovering the secrets of her configuration. Chapter 13. Lunar landscapes. At 2:30 in the morning, the projectile was over the 13th lunar parallel, and at the effective distance of 500 miles, reduced by the glasses to 5, it still seemed impossible, however, that it could ever touch any part of the disk. Its motive speed, comparatively so moderate, was inexplicable to President Barbicane. At that distance from the moon, it must have been considerable. To enable it to bear up against her attraction, here was a phenomenon, the cause of which escaped them again. Besides, time failed them to investigate the cause. All lunar relief was defiling under the eyes of the travelers, and they would not lose a single detail. Under the glasses the disk appeared at the distance of 5 miles. What would an aeronaut borne to this distance from the earth distinguish on its surface? We cannot say, since the greatest ascension has not been more than 25,000 feet. This, however, is an exact description of what Barbicane and his companions saw at this height. Large patches of different colors appeared on the disk. Selenographers are not agreed upon the nature of these colors. There are several, and rather vividly marked. Julius Schmidt pretends that, if the terrestrial oceans were dried up, a Selenite observer could not distinguish on the globe a greater diversity of shades between the oceans and the continental plains than those on the moon present to a terrestrial observer. According to him, the color common to the vast plains, known by the name of seas, is a dark gray mixed with green and brown. Some of the large craters present the same appearance. Barbicane knew this opinion of the German selenographer, an opinion shared by Barr and Moedler. Observation has proved that Wright was on their side, and not on that of some astronomers, who admit the existence of only gray on the moon's surface. In some parts green was very distinct, such as springs, according to Julius Schmidt, from the seas of Serenity and Humors. Barbicane also noticed large craters, without any interior cones, which shed a bluish tint similar to the reflection of a sheet of steel freshly polished. These colors belonged really to the lunar disk, and did not result, as some astronomers say, either from the imperfection in the objective of the glasses, or from the interposition of the terrestrial atmosphere. Not a doubt existed in Barbicane's mind with regard to it, as he observed it through space, and so could not commit any optical error. He considered the establishment of this fact as an acquisition to science. Now were these shades of green, belonging to tropical vegetation, kept up by a low dense atmosphere? He could not yet say. Farther on, he noticed a reddish tint, quite defined. The same shade had before been observed at the bottom of an isolated enclosure, known by the name of Lichtenberg's Circle, which is situated near the Hercynian Mountains on the borders of the moon. But they could not tell the nature of it. They were not more fortunate with regard to another peculiarity of the disk, for they could not decide upon the cause of it. Michel Ardan was watching near the president, when he noticed long white lines, vividly lighted up by the direct rays of the sun. It was a succession of luminous furrows, very different from the radiation of Copernicus not long before. They ran parallel with each other. Michel, with his usual readiness, hastened to exclaim, "Look there, cultivated fields." "Cultivated fields," replied Nicole, shrugging his shoulders. "Plowed, at all events," retorted Michel Ardan. "But what laborers those Selenites must be, and what giant oxen they must harness to their plow to cut such furrows." "They are not furrows," said Barbicane. "They are rifts." "Rifts stuff," replied Michel mildly. "But what do you mean by rifts in the scientific world?" Barbicane immediately enlightened his companion as to what he knew about lunar rifts. He knew that they were a kind of furrow found on every part of the disk which was not mountainous. That these furrows, generally isolated, measured from 400 to 500 leagues in length. That their breadth varied from 1,000 to 1,500 yards, and that their borders were strictly parallel